Centuries ago, a terrifying threat menaced the world. Armies of warrior nomads burst out of Central Asia, killing and looting from Europe to Japan. Their names still evoke death and devastation. Mongol, Tartar, Hun. They were unstoppable, but somehow they had to be stopped. To save their ancient empire, Chinese engineers would have to perform a miracle. And they did. They built the greatest military defenses the world had ever seen.
This is the killing zone. This is where all hell would be let loose.
An awesome shield for China to trap and annihilate the terrifying invaders from the north. The Great Wall of China, the biggest construction project on Earth. 1,000 fortified passes, 10,000 watchtowers, built where building anything seemed impossible, across waterless deserts, on near vertical slopes, into chasms, even underwater.
The Great Wall far exceeds any such accomplishment in the West, including the Egyptian ability to create the Great Pyramids.
It was an epic achievement, but achieved through epic suffering. Hundreds of thousands died building the wall, forced into slavery, then worked to death by some of history's most ruthless tyrants.
The human cost of building this wall was absolutely gigantic.
The Great Wall of China was one of mankind's most incredible feats. But what is its real legacy? Is it a monument to genius or a testament to tragedy? Beijing 2005. Over China, electronic eyes are starting to reveal something never seen before. The first complete picture of an ancient wonder of the world, the Great Wall of China. In reality, a series of walls built by different dynasties over 16 centuries. The most ambitious construction project in history. No monument on Earth has so captured the imagination or spawned so many myths. Some say there's enough material in the Great Wall to encircle the Earth. But the usual estimate of its length is 10,000 kilometers, the distance from Miami to the North Pole. So is this just a great myth?
We have to remember that the Chinese built many great walls. And in total, if we look at them together, they would extend for a distance of more than 50,000 kilometers. That's 35,000 miles.
At the equator, the circumference of the Earth is 25,000 miles, about 40,000 kilometers. So it's not a myth. There'd be material to spare. It's also been said you can see the Great Wall from the moon with the naked eye. Is that true?
China put its first man in space in 2003, and he was asked the inevitable question. And I expected him to say with great national pride, yes, I could see our Great Wall crossing our motherland. But surprisingly, he said no. But interestingly, an American astronaut, an astronaut on Apollo 17, joined the discussion, and he said, on my return to Earth, I looked out of my capsule and I could see the Great Wall of China. And he added, you only have to have good eyesight and know where to look.
Among the earthbound, geographer William Lindsay has seen more of the Great Wall than anyone. He's followed it from one side of China to the other. For him, calling the wall great doesn't begin to do it justice.
The Great Wall, I believe, is the world's most famous building. People dream about coming to China and walking on it for just 30 minutes or an hour. And those with imagination realize this wall continues to the west for 2,000 kilometers, to the east for 3,000 kilometers. As the crow flies, in terms of the twisting route, we don't really know. And for me, that's the great thing about the Great Wall of China. It's the most famous building in the world, and it's the least known.
But what we do know is incredible. A story that begins over 2,000 years ago, when one man single-handedly created China.
Qin Shi was known as the first emperor of China. He came to the throne at a time when the warring states had been struggling with each other for 250 years. And finally, he beat off his last rivals and he established the first state of China. That's why it's called China, after his name, Qin.
But if China was to survive, Qin Shi Huangdi would have to deal with another formidable challenge: the warrior horsemen who plundered at will along the northern frontier. An enemy who could attack anywhere, then melt away into the deserts and mountains.
The raiders came and they took not only goods, but they also took populace for slaves, and they destroyed and slaughtered.
China's first emperor came up with a solution that was stunningly simple and amazingly bold. He'd stop the horsemen in their tracks with a gigantic wall. He handed the seemingly impossible task to a man as ruthless as himself, General Meng Tian. The challenge was mind-boggling: fortify the entire northern frontier at breakneck speed. The construction method would have to be simple and cheap. Fortunately, the Chinese had already perfected it. Farmers still use exactly the same technique, ramming earth into a frame until it's hard as rock. But as time-lapse video shows, it's back-breaking labor and painfully slow. Even with an entire village on the job, in 45 minutes, the wall rises only 2 inches, just 5 centimeters. For Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, the lesson was obvious. Only an immense labor force, like none ever assembled, could build a wall across the whole of China. But manpower wasn't a problem for such a powerful and pitiless ruler. His soldiers rounded up hundreds of thousands of peasants, marched them north, and worked them till they dropped. China has never forgotten their sufferings, immortalized in the ancient tale of Meng Xiangnu. The emperor's soldiers ripped her beloved husband from her arms and dragged him away to labor on the wall. Cold and hungry, she searched for him across the vast expanse of China. At last, she arrived at the Great Wall. She'd found her husband, but too late. He was already dead from exhaustion. The legend says that in her grief, Meng let out a terrible cry. A shriek so powerful, it knocked down miles of the wall. But Meng's tragedy wasn't over. Protesting at the emperor's cruelty, she threw herself into the sea and drowned. After more than 2,000 years, the anguish of this young woman and thousands like her still haunts the soul of China. Near the start of the Great Wall, a seaside temple keeps her memory alive and recalls the appalling human cost of history's most ambitious construction project. As many as 1 million workers may have died. For centuries, the Chinese have believed the wall holds the bones of thousands of dead workers. But is that just another Great Wall myth? It depends on whom you ask.
I think it's a myth. The ancient Chinese had many ways of getting rid of unwanted bodies, slaves. They used to chuck them into wells, and they used to bury them headless in cemeteries adjacent to where they were building. But the wall here has such tight construction, and it is so compacted that I think a body in it would probably be more of a nuisance than anything else.
In Gansu, the Great Wall crosses some very remote places. So far, we've found bits of pottery and animal bones buried inside. We haven't found any human bones yet, but I'm sure we'll find them one day.
We asked the experts to try something never attempted before. Put the legend to the test. They'll use earth-penetrating technology to search for human remains in a section of the Qin Emperor's wall. Their magnetometer peers inside the ancient rammed earth and measures its density. A computer converts these measurements into a kind of X-ray of the wall. Different densities show up as different colors, so it's fairly easy to locate solid objects. But there's a problem. Rammed earth is almost as dense as bone.
So if there were a body in the wall here, how would you recognize it?
As far as I know, there's still no reliable method to detect just bones. But if there's a pile of bodies, we'll be able to see them. There'll be a big difference in the magnetic signature. But one individual body would be very hard to spot.
This time, the magnetometer didn't locate human remains, but it's too early to bury this compelling legend. With thousands of miles of wall still to be explored, the mystery remains. The experts do agree that the first emperor's mighty wall brought appalling hardship to his people. And it failed to protect them from barbarians.
The greatest challenge to defending the walls was always finding motivated, sufficient manpower. Generally, people in the local area were impressed. There was also a wide variety of convicts, mercenaries, and other barbarians who were recruited for the task, but the walls were often understaffed and ill-provisioned, and therefore morale was low, many deserted, and this left tremendous gaps.
Through those gaps rode nomad raiders. The Chinese were no safer. When the first emperor suddenly died in 210 BC, they'd had enough of the Qin Dynasty.
You can imagine the smouldering discontent throughout the empire because of all the works that were going on, all the people sent up to build the wall, and consequently there were a whole series of uprisings, some led by nobles, some led by peasants, and they all converged upon the capital, killed the second Qin emperor, and that was the end of that.
Another casualty was General Meng. He killed himself. He said he deserved to die. His wall had been a crime against nature. The Qin Dynasty lasted less than 20 years, but its engineering legacy has endured for 2,000. Soon, an even more ambitious dynasty would build the wall to the very edge of the world and turn it from a strategy of defense into a weapon of empire. Building the Great Wall began more than 2,000 years ago, when China's first emperor ordered his generals to halt raiding barbarians. They erected a giant rammed earth barrier across hundreds of miles, a mammoth task that killed thousands of laborers. But there was even harder work to come. The Gobi Desert in western China. One of the toughest places imaginable for mankind's biggest construction project. Even with today's technology, building the Great Wall in this unforgiving place would be a challenge. 2,000 years ago, it might have seemed impossible. But the destiny of China was at stake. In ancient times, bands of fierce warriors rode across these deserts to plunder northern China. Their names sparked terror across Europe and Asia. The Huns. When they reached the wall, built by China's first emperor, they found it almost undefended, so they simply went around it. To make matters worse, China was ruled by a new dynasty, the Han. The Han emperors were still too insecure to take on the nemesis from the north, especially in remote areas like the Gobi Desert. So they tried diplomacy.
They used a combination of marriage alliances, tribute and trade relationships, and other soft measures to ameliorate the threat, and simply bribing and buying them off.
Buying time for China to grow stronger. In 140 BC, China's moment arrives. A different sort of man becomes emperor. Han Wudi intends to fight the Huns and win.
He embraced martial culture, developed cavalry commanders who were comfortable in fighting nomadic style and could carry the campaign to the steppe.
As he prepares to attack the Huns, Han Wudi also boosts his defenses. He orders his engineers to rebuild the first emperor's wall, a simple task where they can ram the earth into a solid mass. But the Gobi Desert is a different matter. In some places there's no soil, only sand and gravel. Nobody can pound this material into a wall. Under pressure, it just crumbles. 2,000 years ago, hauling in tons of soil from the faraway east was not an option. Han Wudi's engineers had to find another solution. They did, and it was incredibly simple. Where they couldn't build up, they dug down, excavating mile after mile of ditches and moats to halt the Huns' advance. But to defend the border, the Chinese had to know where their elusive enemy was. They needed an early warning system, a chain of signal towers across the Gobi. But how could they build 30-foot towers when all they had was crumbling sand and gravel? As it turned out, they had something much stronger. Han Wudi's engineers found that if they reinforced their sand and gravel towers with layers of reeds, they'd hold together. Engineers use the same technique today, but instead of reeds, they reinforce their concrete buildings with metal rods called rebar. Reeds played another vital role in the Great Wall's early warning system. Sentries used them to light their signal fires when Hun raiders approached. You can still see bundles of reeds stacked around the old watchtowers, still ready for action, but fossilized by the desert winds. The smoke signals carried information much faster than a messenger on horseback. Burning wolf dung produced the tallest and straightest columns of smoke. Different colors and amounts of smoke signaled whether the threat was from a small raiding party or a massive invasion force. Over the years, the Han engineers perfected their technique of building with layers of reeds. They thrust their walls deep into the Gobi. The desert winds have sandblasted these once formidable battlements down to a third of their original size. But they're still impressive after 20 centuries. By taking the fight to the enemy, Han Wudi forced the Huns back from northern China and changed the history of the world. For the first time, merchant caravans could travel safely between Asia and the West, along the fabled Silk Route, all the way to Rome. But the Han raiders were never far away. Emperor Wu Di knew he'd need to protect the vital oases along the Silk Route. That meant building a fortress in the middle of nowhere, at Yumengguan, China's new western gateway. Han Wu Di's engineers would have to erect an invasion-proof fortress. The only building material was the soft clay blown south from Mongolia. It was a challenge that pushed their ancient rammed earth building system to the limit. From wind-borne dust, they built a fort with walls 5 times higher than a man. Strong enough to still be guarding the Yumen Pass after 2,000 years, still battling the desert, the wind, and time. Today, all that's left is the central blockhouse. But when it was new, this last outpost of the empire was state-of-the-art. As its first line of defense, the Chinese developed a clever alarm system, a ditch filled with fine sand just outside the walls. Anyone sneaking up on the fort at night would leave telltale footprints. But for the Chinese, Yumengguan was also the last outpost of civilization. Beyond its walls lay the terrifying realms of the nomad warriors. Anyone condemned to exile left its safety with a heavy heart, doomed to death, or a life of slavery among the barbarians. Emperor Han Wu Di built more than 600 miles of wall to protect the Silk Route. His troops pounded the Huns for 30 years, leaving them badly weakened. More than 1,000 years later, a much deadlier enemy would mass its armies before the Great Wall. But this would be the greatest of all the Great Walls, a masterpiece of military engineering, the mightiest fortifications ever seen on Earth. 2,000 years ago, engineers of China's Han Dynasty met a nearly impossible challenge, building the Great Wall across one of the harshest deserts on Earth. Defending their country against the marauding Huns, protecting caravans along the famed Silk Route. But centuries later, China faced an even deadlier threat. It was the time of the Mongols. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan and his terrifying armies burst out of Central Asia, conquering an empire that stretched all the way to Europe. The Mongols overran China and ruled it for 100 years, until a new dynasty, the Ming, pushed them back across the border. The year was 1368, and no one in Ming China wanted to see the Mongols again.
So they set about building the Ming Dynasty Great Wall, which turned out to be the most elaborate and extensive and strongest system of border defenses in Chinese history. And the Chinese were prepared to go to any lengths, any amount of labor, money, time, to make sure their civilization would not be disturbed again.
But like earlier dynasties, the Ming emperors didn't have enough troops to crush the barbarian horde. They could only try to keep the Mongols out, and even that would be a daunting challenge. The new imperial capital of Beijing seemed well protected by a range of mountains between the city and the northern steppes. But a series of passes sliced through these mountains. For Mongol horsemen, nature made expressways to the heart of the Ming capital. To save their city and their empire, the Ming would have to fortify every one of those passes. Unlike earlier dynasties, they didn't leave such an important task to slaves. They called on their best engineers and soldiers. The most brilliant of them all was General Qin Dynasty.
The outstanding character of the Ming Dynasty was Qin Dynasty, the commander of this military region just north of the ancient capital of Beijing. And he was a man that spent a long time out here in the field. And he saw that a lot of effort was going into Great Wall construction, but he felt it didn't necessarily guarantee a good military performance. So he advocated greater manning levels on the wall, and that needed accommodation. So the towers with enclosed space, rooms, were his design. And also the wall made almost entirely of bricks, again, is his design, because by using bricks, the builders could incorporate all those small design features that would make the defense more efficient. For sure, during the Ming Dynasty, Qin Dynasty was Mr. Great Wall.
This would be Qin Dynasty's toughest challenge, a place called Gubeikou. 500 years ago, Gubeikou was the weakest point in Beijing's defenses. A pass that gave invaders a straight shot at the heart of the capital. It's an easy invasion route for men on horseback and a defender's nightmare. So Qin Dynasty set out to transform this cakewalk into a killing zone. First, he built a chain of beacon towers along the mountain peaks north of the wall. Then, his engineers extended the Great Wall right across the valley to halt any cavalry charge. Massive gates let the river pass through, but kept out invaders. Anyone who did try to penetrate the defenses would be trapped in the side valleys, where the defenders could slaughter them.
It's variously estimated that walls multiply the effectiveness of a single soldier by anywhere from 5 to 13 times. And if properly defended as part of a system, they are very effective.
Key to the defense system was an age-old military principle: hold the high ground. That meant building China's biggest walls, where building anything was a huge challenge. Places like Simatai, knife-edge cliffs near Gubeikou, mountain ridges barely wide enough to walk on, almost impossible to build on. We can only marvel that they did.
Ming Dynasty brick like this is about 13 kilograms, 25, 27 pounds. An enormous effort was required to get the material up to its point of use. And I've never actually tried to carry one of these up there. I guess it's the only way to find out how difficult or easy it was. Let's go. There are no logistical records detailing the basics of wall building, how the material was moved, whether they used animals, whether they used levers. And the only explanation seems to be that at the time they thought in future no one is going to be remotely interested in how something as mundane as a border wall was constructed. Oh, finally, one brick, more than 5 minutes. Whew. The amazing thing for me is that we don't know how many bricks this Ming Dynasty wall contains, but everyone has been carried up here. Everyone has the fingerprints and the sweat of a builder. It's the most labor-intensive construction project in human history. Time for another brick, I think.
But the mountain passes weren't the only weak spot in China's defenses. On the coast east of Beijing, there's a flat strip more than 6 miles wide. Ideal country for warriors on horseback, another invasion highway, and another major challenge for General Qi Jiguang. Here, his defenses would have to start below the waterline, or invaders would simply go around them. His solution was to extend the Great Wall more than 60 feet into the sea at Shanhaiguan. It's a massive construction that sits on a natural reef and huge stone slabs. Like other key points in Qi Jiguang's new wall, Shanhaiguan was part of an interlocking system. The Great Wall's eastern end was a complex of 5 forts. A series of walls, gates, and fortifications created an impenetrable barrier across the entrance to China, called the First Pass Under Heaven. Ming engineers quarried local stone to reinforce existing walls and support new ones. At Shanhaiguan, quarrying still goes on today. Heavy machineries made life a little easier, but it's still backbreaking work with fairly crude results. A better solution was standard-sized bricks joined with mortar, though the color of the mortar gave rise to an especially grim legend.
It was long believed that the mortar between the bricks on the Ming Dynasty wall was made of human bones. That gave it its white colour. In fact, the whiteness comes from the burnt lime from limestone. But it actually contains another rather unusual ingredient, but definitely not human bones.
To Chinese, the secret ingredient was anything but unusual. The emperor's engineers found that the high starch content of rice helped mortar bond firmly to the bricks. Centuries later, the strength of this unlikely mix is obvious. In places where wind and rain have worn away the wall, the mortar has outlasted the bricks. The sturdy Ming walls helped keep towns like Shanhaiguan safe for generations. But General Qi Jiguang knew better than to rely on bricks and mortar for protection. Just as important were the men who guarded the walls and the weapons they carried. The deadly combination of strong fortifications, well-trained soldiers, and powerful weapons would always give defenders the edge.
The Chinese also had repeating and multiple bolt crossbows so that they could fire several shots in a minute from the repeating bolt. They also had larger versions capable of ranges of 1,000 yards or more, which were known to take down 6 men and their horses at once.
Young Fu Shi is a bowmaker, like every man in his family for generations. He still makes crossbows, just like those that defended the Great Wall against the Mongols. Nomads out on the steppes couldn't make the complicated trigger mechanisms, so the Chinese had a head start in the arms race. The crossbow was the AK-47 of its day, lethal at short range and with a fast reload. The semi-automatic version fired 10 shots in 20 seconds.
A typical defense of a wall or a city would require 2 or 3 million arrows at one time, so you can imagine the capacity that was required The nomads were always at a disadvantage in terms of weapons. They primarily relied on bows and fairly light crossbows. China had a whole range of weapons, and once gunpowder was invented, they had arsenals to produce explosives.
And with the advantage of height and a clear line of sight, they could hardly miss. General Qi Jiguang had thought of everything. His men held every bit of high ground. He'd interlinked his defenses, so troops in one tower could defend their comrades in another. And if attackers made it onto the wall, the defenders could fight them every step of the way. He'd designed this web of defenses to do one thing: channel attackers into a free fire zone where his men could slaughter them.
The wall is built, garrisoned, decades of peace, and then finally the moment of truth. Attackers arrive, and what a shock lies in store. The Great Wall, a building the likes of which they could never have imagined. This is the killing zone. This is where all hell would be let loose. From the wall itself, the release of arrows and cannon fire. Down in the valleys, more surprises, landmines, ground thunder, iron spikes to lame the horses.
With such impregnable defenses and overwhelming firepower, China should have been secure. Who could have predicted the world's most formidable fortifications would fall without firing a shot? During the 14th and 15th centuries, China's Ming Dynasty expanded and modernized the Great Wall to protect Beijing from marauding Mongols, the most elaborate system of defenses ever built. Confident their capital was safe at last, the Ming emperors turned their attention to another problem: China's far western border. Here, the Great Wall ended in one of the emptiest deserts in the world, where cargoes of treasure, silk and spices passed east and west along the fabled Silk Route. The caravans paid hefty taxes to the imperial coffers and made easy prey for nomad bandits. They needed the best protection money could buy. And that meant building new and massive fortifications between the mountains and the desert, at a place called Jiayuguan. The Jiayuguan fort would have to be incredibly strong. In this isolated place, a besieged garrison might have to hold out for weeks before help arrived. Somehow, the engineers had to conjure a bastion of empire from crumbling gravel and sand. What they built was a masterpiece of military engineering, a fort within a fort. Double protection for the defenders and double trouble for invaders. Jiayuguan's brilliant design ensures anyone entering the fort is always visible and vulnerable. From their perches on the ramparts, the sentries could pick off any target at will. Anyone who entered had to navigate a daunting maze of gates and passageways, towers and walls, a Chinese puzzle designed to confuse attackers. No wonder the Ming emperors called this place the strongest fortress under heaven. No one ever captured it. No one even tried. The cost would have been far too high. Even tourists can pick off targets from the battlements. Professional soldiers could slaughter anyone who attacked. But Jiayuguan needed more than a clever layout to make it strong. Earlier dynasties had built massive walls in this desert using what nature provided: soil, sand, gravel, and reeds. But by the 15th century, The Ming and their enemies were fighting with far deadlier weapons. Like some of the world's earliest artillery. So Jiayu Guan needed something much tougher than clay and gravel. Again, the fort builders met the challenge with a brilliantly simple solution. They still relied on local clay and gravel to build their walls, but covered them with multiple layers of densely packed bricks, baked hard in the desert sun, and they made sure to build in arrow slits to discourage tampering. Jiayu Guan's thick skin made it an enduring fortress and gave the Great Wall another enduring legend, the story of the last brick.
It's said that the architect in charge of the project calculated precisely how many bricks he needed. But he was also warned by the administrators. If there were any mistakes, of course, there would be heads rolling. Well, what happened? The fortress was completed and there was one brick left over, and they put it on a ledge above one of the archways. And the architect was asked, "Hey, what's this? The last brick of the Great Wall, it wasn't required." The explanation he gave was the brick had in fact been placed there by a supernatural being. And when people heard this, no one dared to remove it because they thought the fortress would be conquered, and the brick is still there to this day.
Jiayu Guan was a triumph, but it still stood alone on the western border, far from any other garrisons. Unless its commander could signal for help, attackers might still overwhelm it and threaten all of western China. The answer was blowing in the wind. Ming military planners perfected the Imperial smoke signaling system. Jiayu Guan's commander could send a message to Beijing 1,200 miles away in just one day. Safe behind their massive walls, the Ming emperors ruled China for almost 300 years. By the early 1600s, the Great Wall was stronger than ever. But the dynasty that had invested so much in it was starting to crumble. The Ming Empire was in turmoil. And soon, nobody in the capital would be returning calls from the frontier forts. By the early 17th century, the Great Wall of China had become the world's most formidable system of defense. Faced with the terrifying threat of Mongol invasions, the Ming emperors had spent 3 centuries reinforcing their northern frontier. They armored earthen walls with brick to withstand cannonballs and catapults, and equipped their troops with the most lethal weapons of their time. The Great Wall should have kept the Ming in power forever. But the great fortifications had a fatal weakness, one the emperors hadn't counted on.
One of the main problems of walls is that they are often overcome because of subversion. Nomadic people offered great incentives to anyone who would defect, and in fact promised to spare the lives of people who would surrender.
Shanhai Guan on the Yellow Sea. This wide coastal plain had always been an easy road to riches for marauding horsemen. General Qi Guan had solved the problem by building an impenetrable barrier. But now, the Ming Dynasty was in its death throes. Taxed to the limit to pay for the Great Wall, the peasants rose up in revolt. And a northern tribe called the Manchu launched an invasion down the coastal strip. When they reached Shanhai Guan, its massive defenses halted their advance. Inside, the Chinese watched and waited. Then the garrison commander made a decision that changed the course of Chinese history. He threw open the gates and joined forces with the Manchu to crush the peasant uprising. The world's most sophisticated fortifications were abandoned. Soon, they'd be almost forgotten, their brutal history mixing with myth and legend. But the Chinese people know that many of the wall's darkest stories are painfully true. Countless numbers of their ancestors paid for the Great Wall with their sweat and blood. They've come to see it as a symbol of nationhood, and they're working hard to preserve it. Where the wall straddles vital road and rail links, that's often impossible. And everywhere, it's a huge task. It will take many years to repair even the most accessible sections. Machines can perform some of the ancient tasks, but the sheer scale of the project is staggering.
Shanhai Guan has 4 gates. The only one that's in good condition is the East Gate, the first pass under heaven. We're currently restoring the West Gate. It will take a team of 50 about 7 months to complete. Repairs in just our conservation area, only 1.5 square kilometers, will cost $250 million.
The walls made of tamped earth will take even longer to fix because there are no shortcuts. The only way to do it is how they've always done it.
There's no way you can use a machine to build this type of wall. The soil is dry. It can't be piled up. So the method we use is the ancient one that's been passed down to us. Of course, the material isn't expensive. It's just soil. But labor costs are high because all the earth has to be carried up on the backs of people.
Scientists plan to map the entire wall system, right across China. But in many places, even finding the wall is a challenge. So they're using satellites and aircraft with remote sensing to reveal sections of the wall that have vanished over the centuries. At the Laboratory of Digital Earth Sciences in Beijing, they're rebuilding Shanhai Guan inside a computer. And this is just the start. Someday, it should be possible to travel the entire length of the Great Wall this way, an incredible journey through time and space. The defensive walls across northern China are on a scale that dwarfs every other construction on Earth. Through all kinds of terrain, beneath the sea, over jagged mountain ranges, into unforgiving deserts, the wall builders faced endless challenges and found ingenious ways to overcome them.
The Great Wall is a remarkable edifice and a testament to human achievement and to organization, the ability to draw men together, whether willingly or not, and far exceeds any such accomplishment in the West, including the Egyptian ability to create the Great Pyramids.
It was essential to make the wall stronger because this was not a conflict that lasted 10 years or 100 years. It was a protracted and violent cultural conflict.
As they fought off terrifying enemies over 20 centuries, the Chinese perfected the art of war and the science of defense. They developed many of the technologies we still use in construction today. But they paid a terrible price, suffering on a scale we can barely comprehend. So if the Great Wall symbolizes anything, it's China's determination to survive, whatever the cost.